Hello, I'm Josephine Burton and welcome back to the Dash Arts podcast, seeing the world through an artistic lens. Earlier in 2021, we held a Dash Café, Disco and the Atomic War, which explored the infiltration of the Soviet Union by American TV in the 70s and 80s, and ongoing digital subversion today. What we lost from not being able to have a drink at the bar, we gained through digital technology, as I was able to welcome guests from Finland, Estonia, France and the UK to our Zoom room. We screened short snippets from Kiur Aarma and Jaak Kilmi's charming and highly entertaining documentary Disco and the Atomic War, and I chatted with Kiur himself, Kirsti Narinen, a Finnish diplomat and former ambassador who basked in the near-midnight sun from her holiday home in northern Finland, political analyst and Counterpoint director Catherine Fieschi, and author and journalist Peter Pomerantsev. I started the evening asking my guests to recount the first time they realised through TV or culture more widely that there was another way to see the world. Kirsti kicked off by telling us about her experience of watching Soviet adverts in Estonia, in contrast to the Finnish ads that began to make their way into Estonia across the Gulf of Finland through secretly redirected TV aerials.
They were also told the stories. They showed the society, the sides of society that were something astonishing for them, and for us quite normal.
You remember watching them and experiencing them live when you were in Estonia, did you?
Yes, because when I was living in Leningrad, then we traveled to Estonia, so the contrast of the Russian TV and the Finnish television in Estonia was rather, how would I say, large, huge, fundamental. And this was also something that when the Estonians that were watching the Finnish television, for them commercials was something also unreal. And those who thought that the Finnish television was propagandistic. And then when people realized that actually, when they then came to Finland and saw that, for instance, the meat counters actually are in every store, that it's not propagandistic, that it's true, it's describing the reality. There was one discussion I had myself. There was this Communist Party member who was saying that that's when I realized that they have lied to us, that what else did they lie?
Kiur, is that familiar to you, those stories?
Yes, basically. I doubt if there were a lot of people in Estonia back in the 70s or 80s who would have doubted that they were living in a market economy is real. Estonians were quite aware of the other side there. But the only thing or one of the things the television cannot actually give you is the smell of things. Probably the first memory is the smell of this Finnish licorice. You know, the candies, the black candies, usually children tend to hate them. But
the licorice.
Licorice, yes.
Licorice.
Yeah.
Licorice. But that emotion with the smell of licorice, when I was probably like 10 years old, visiting Finland first time in my life, that was so impressive and strong. So I secretly still buy and eat them. Although my kids, they really hate this stuff.
Lovely. I love that it's something so kind of visceral, and that taste and the smell of the licorice. What about you, Peter? Do you have like memories of those transitions?
I'd love to say so, but I should be honest. I was 9 months old when I was removed from the Soviet Union by my parents. So all I had time to do was throw up all over the Soviet Union, and that was it really. And I left. I had it the other way around though, because I grew up in North London as a refugee, but I did have all this stuff from the Soviet Union. So I had these records, these Melodia records, which had all these amazing Russian, Soviet children's musicals like Bemensky Muzikante, which is absolutely amazing. And I had all my parents' books because they brought them with them. I grew up in London thinking I'm the only person who has these book covers to Pushkin and Dostoevsky, and I'm the only person in the world who has this secret, wonderful stash of records. And I remember going to what was then already Russia in around 91, just after, everything fell apart, and realizing that there is a whole world where people have these records and the same books. And I just, it was very, very strange. I thought it was completely my own little universe. And this moment of understanding that I, you know, that had actually been a little reflection of a whole civilization of sight and sound.
And did it feel like you came home then as a result? Did it feel you felt like you'd landed somewhere familiar?
It's more like Solaris, you know, the end of Solaris, where I'm clearly on an alien planet. For some reason, like my house is there. You know, it's very that kind of thing.
Right. Fabulous. And finally, Catherine, what about any reflections on when you had that first encounter with otherness? I guess what was behind the Iron Curtain?
So I had a kind of reverse experience of that too, but from a different place in a sense. I moved to the United States from northern Italy in 1976 when I was 8. And Turin in northern Italy in 1976, I mean, it was not deprived, but, it was gray. It was, there was very little choice. It was a modest kind of life in some ways. And we moved to Chicago. My father was transferred to Chicago as a diplomat. And my sister and I left Italy weeping and weeping and weeping that we were leaving Italy behind and our friends behind. And within 24 hours, we were fully signed up members of American Consumer Society. Within 24 hours, we discovered, mini packets of cereals. We discovered Saturday morning cartoons. We discovered deep shag pile carpet. And it was just extraordinary because, our allegiance kind of flipped in absolutely no time. Within a day, we were saying to each other, "We're never leaving, are we? No, we're never leaving." I certainly wasn't coming from behind the Iron Curtain, but I was coming from a different world and discovered the pull of the United States and how powerful it was.
The evening was inspired by Kiur's amazingly beautiful, funny, and poignant film. We're going to show you some clips, and we're going to start our evening with the opening sequence from Kiur's beautiful film, Disco and the Atomic War.
See olen mina, Jaak. Parasjagu olen ma 8-aastane. Ma elan Õismäel, uues elurajoonis, mida pidevalt ehitatakse. Mu elu on suurepärane, sest ma näen Soome televisiooni. Minu isa õpetab meid pildistama.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you. So that was the very beginning of the film. Kiur, is that your story? Is it Jack's story? Is it an amalgamation of the two?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, it's not like my film only. It's a close duo or tandem with Jaak. Basically, it's kind of... it's a series of different conflicts. First of all, it's a kind of conflict between the generations here in Estonia, as we are born in 74 and 75. And if we had been born like 3-4 years earlier, we definitely had been kind of heroes of revolution, because the famous singing revolution took place like 1988. But we were like 12, 13-year-old boys by this time. So we needed our own kind of big story. And watching secretly commercials from Finnish television, that was big story enough for us. So we kind of invented this world and described this quite schizophrenic world.
So you've created this beautiful film, which is both your own story, and there's a lovely story of the Dallas sharing between cousins.
This is a true story. Yeah, that was Jaak's niece, and they really didn't see the Finnish television in the southern part of the country. That was actually only directed for the capital of Estonia, Tallinn. So like 30 kilometers ahead of Tallinn, you couldn't see these. You couldn't see the Finnish TV. And yes, that is a kind of inner cultural conflict within the country. And it is still seen today. You could like hear it in the talks of the friends from southern Estonia. Quite many, but like Finnish loan words.
The language is different. The language of those people who didn't have access to Finnish TV.
Cultural experience.
Have less language.
Experience is different. Yeah.
Are there real tensions between the generations that grew up in politically tensions that grow up in Tallinn and those who didn't have access to cartoons and the Dallas and the Knight Rider? Have you seen an impact on that through the generation as those young people grew up?
Yeah, I would like to stress that the whole story with the Finnish television is not political at all, because Finnish television was quite neutral.
Kirsti, you were a diplomat during this time, obviously observing what had gone on, but also spending time in St. Petersburg, in Leningrad. Do you remember the stories of how the aerials were being angled into Estonia and the kind of impact of that culturally?
Oh, yes. And it was, of course, it was a bit surrealistic. I visited a friend in Tallinn who was actually writing with the Finnish TV programs and then copying them with a copying machine at her work. It was so unreal to me. How does this work? And what does this mean? Because, television for the Finnish people was quite normal. And yet, of course, I had been watching the Soviet television. I know that the news, it was the propagandistic, but I think you referred quite beautifully to the key point here. It was the contrast. When people saw the television, and the Finnish television was not unproblematic, just like you described. I fully agree, because we also had our political, searching for the balance in the 70s, which means that it was not portraying the West as a paradise for anybody. It was just the real world. And I think that one of the main messages there was that as it wasn't political, it was the Finnish television for the Finnish people, that the real world prepared Estonians for the reforms that then took place. And then another angle to that was, like you referred to, that in the 70s, there were still a lot of people who remembered how the Estonian Republic worked and looked like and felt and smelled like until 1940. And they had been in Finland. There were people who had visited Finland in the 30s. So it was just kind of the real world for them was in the television. And then when they looked out of the window, or when I looked out of the window of the Viru Hotel in Tallinn, I saw the reality that was very far from reality.
Have you seen this film?
Oh, yes, I saw it when it came out, then immediately in 2000 something. When was it? 9 or 10. And I loved it because it was portraying the story like with irony, almost parody as a comedy. And that also being a contradiction when the life itself was very far from being funny or entertaining. But they really, really beautifully grasped the feeling and the picture of that time.
And when was it officially recognized that the Finnish broadcasting TV had slightly altered the angles in order to enable the broadcast to reach Estonia?
Well, it was actually when the TV mast, I've spoken to the people. It says in the film that it was the TV mast was put there to cover Estonia, but that's not quite the whole truth. It was put there to cover southern Finland, but the engineers and the technicians and the geologists, they wanted to serve their brothers and sisters in Estonia. So it was really put as far out on the Gulf of Finland as possible, as technically possible. But this was never mentioned to those political decision makers that were actually would probably have had a word against it those days in Finland when the mast was put there. But it was really deliberately put out so that the broadcast would cover as much of Estonia as possible. And this was the civil society that was so much concerned about the fate of our sisters and brothers.
This sense of civil society getting involved, it wasn't just happening in Estonia, with Finland and Estonia. I'm aware, Peter, that you've written quite a lot about Radio Free Europe in your This Is Not Propaganda. I mean, are some of these scenes and ideas familiar to you from other activities that were going on to infiltrate other aspects of the Soviet Union?
Yes. I mean, there are also kind of moments of thaw if we're talking about radio. I think what's so powerful here, it's about TV, which kind of, and the uniqueness of that Gulf of Finland experience. The radio experience, I mean, look, there was lots of like strange moments when Voice of America would be, there'd be a thaw in relations with the Soviet Union, and, Voice of America would not be censored. Radio Free Europe, which was very political, was always censored. But Voice of America was allowed on, and there were times when the BBC wasn't censored. And obviously jazz, and rock and roll were, a huge part of that kind of, public diplomacy, if you want to put it that way. So there were different kind of holes, in the wall. I mean, what's so wonderful about the film is that it brings the television aspect to it.
Kirsti, you were saying that, the Finnish government was not aware of the kind of tweaking of the Finnish broadcasting TV to allow the antennae to go over. I mean, you hypothesized that it was probably that the CIA was involved. Is there any grounds to this hypothesis?
Well, back then we were just asking questions.
Right.
Like, was there any trace, and were the Finnish officials aware, and so on and so on. Actually, we found kind of letter or protocol that was communication between the American embassy in Helsinki with their headquarters that kind of described these questions of how because the Finland was always it was kind of a hotspot. I'm sure Kirsti could describe the history or diplomatic history of Finland more precisely, but that was kind of a front line between the USSR and the Western world. If you actually look around in Finland, you probably see that there are a lot of Finns that are more Americans than the Americans themselves. Like this deep love towards the American cars, music. That must have been a battle for Finland too back then.
Catherine, I would love to bring you in, because I think it would be really helpful for us to have a bit of a sense of understanding, like, we've been bandying around these words like soft power and cultural diplomacy. Can you tell us a little bit about what they all mean? And is this an evidence of a soft power because it was slightly under the radar, or is it more like you can tell us, is it more like a cultural diplomatic act?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that there's such a thing as diplomacy that isn't cultural, to be honest. The term cultural diplomacy is always something that I've found to be a little bit awkward. I think that what's interesting about the kind of soft power that the movie refers to and sets the scene for. There's a couple of things, and they're particularly interesting, I think, when we look at things from the point of view of where we are today. What we see in this film, which I have to say, Kiur, I'm a huge fan of your film. And one of the reasons I discovered it was when I briefly worked for the British Council, and one of my missions when I was with the British Council that they didn't necessarily take too kindly to, I think, was the fact that I kept saying or trying to show that potentially the kind of soft power and the kind of cultural diplomacy that something like an arm of the Foreign Office could engage in, such as the things that the British Council were doing and doing very well, that to some extent that those days were numbered, right? The days of that kind of soft power, that is in the hands of a very defined set of actors, were slightly numbered. And I have to admit that I used I kind of used your film to, pose the question, what happens when everyone can be this vector of soft power? And you set the stage for it, I think, brilliantly in your film, because, it's kids, writing letters, playing gatekeeper with, in a sense, the currency of soft power at the time in school and, and in your neighborhood and so on. But what happens when everyone has access, or the illusion of access, to culture, when everyone can be, a vector of culture, when everybody can play, the diplomat, or, as Peter might also argue, the propagandist, right? Or the illusionist, in some ways, where is the line between the person who, in a sense, plays the role of cultural vector, and then, the person who manipulates, that vector. I think that, the past 10 years, 15 years, even since, you've made the film, things have changed enormously. And even the concept of soft power, is a challenging one, because we used to know, in a sense, where it came from, and I think the nature of soft power changes when it becomes so diffuse, right? When the sources are so multiple, and when the trust in those sources, is no longer what it was. So I think your film raises these questions very, very powerfully, and forces us to look again at, who is the diplomat? Where is the power located, and how is this power diffused? It's changed a lot, and I think that's one of the things that's really, really interesting. And I think also the channels of communication, were such that, I love the references to Dallas, because, when I finally did come back from the United States, in 1981 in France, I arrived, and this was, the world pre-globalization. I knew who had shot JR, right? No one else in my school knew who had shot JR. They were only going to find out a few months later. Now, this is a state of affairs that simply cannot exist anymore, right? Individuals can no longer hold the kind of extraordinary power that I had walking into that French school. And in a sense, that's also what I'm saying, right? Is that, the message emanates from so many places, and the borders, some borders are less porous and some borders are more porous.
The question I've been grappling with that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is there room for, have the messages changed? I mean, is there room still for Dallas to unsettle a nation?
Well, I must admit I've never watched Dallas, although I had to translate the Finnish subtitles to my grandmother. She was the big fan of Dallas. Dallas wasn't the boy stuff, so I cannot comment on Dallas. Sorry, I don't even know who actually shot the GR.
But Catherine does, so she can tell us. But also, Catherine, you mustn't. Your lips are sealed. But do you? I mean, it's interesting, this sort of the fun, gripping stuff that Kiel's grandmother loved. I mean, is there still a space for Dallas in soft power today?
I mean, I think it's quite clear that, if you take, major British exports, right? I don't know, you take something like Downton Abbey. Downton Abbey is absolute part and parcel of the soft power arsenal, of a country like the United Kingdom. I mean, if you take something like The Crown, you get exactly the same effect. I think what's really interesting is, what is and isn't filtering through to us. So for example, if you take a power like China, who is clearly out, to use soft power in various ways, whether it's, obviously through, vaccine diplomacy, as we've seen, in the recent months and so on, but also very, is very keen, therefore, to project a certain kind of power. It'd be interesting to see what, in the end, ends up filtering, to us, because there are efforts, there will be efforts, what does soft power look like from the part of a different kind of empire in 2021? And in the case of Russia, for example, there's the internal soft power and how effective or not effective that is, and whether it's just propaganda. And then, what kind of foreign projection there might be. So I just think these are, hugely changed areas, and I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on it.
Absolutely. Kirsti, please.
Yes, I had a couple of points. First of all, Finnish television had 2 channels those years. It's kind of the abundance of offered TV series wasn't really there. We had Peyton Place, and then we had a couple of Finnish TV series, and then we had Dallas Dynasty later, and then The Bold and the Beautiful. So this was more of a symbolic kind of, living the life of those people whose lives you could not live. And it was brought to you through the television. So this was not about Dallas. This was about any TV series that would have given this opportunity for us. And they were not that many. And this is the difference today, of course. When you have, even in Finland, you would get like 100 channels, which means that you have the Downton Abbey, you have the Crown, and you have all the others. So the kind of the choice is so much wider. That this is why this phenomenon is not there anymore. But, of course, many are trying that. And I think this was also basically the contrast was also, again, in this society that in that film, the co-host people wanted to get one of the basic needs satisfied, and that was to be entertained. And it was not a political syndrome at all. It was being entertained. And the Soviet television wasn't very particularly entertaining because the basic of that was propagandistic upbringing of a homo sovieticus that would have been thinking the way the party wanted it to think and not to want for anything else. And I think that in the film also that the Communist Party leader of the Secretary General in Estonia, he admits at the end that it was the Finnish television that started to eat up the party and the party's regime, but it's actually not that, because that was feeding the basic needs of people. It was responding to the things that people knew that were real and that touched upon them. And this is actually what soft power is, that you filter your listening and hearing through your own value base and your own upbringing, be it then from home or from school. And then if there's a difference, the contrast again. That's when you like to hear the things that you feel comfortable with.
It's a really interesting point, the point you're making about there's so many. I mean, you're all fascinating. But this idea that actually people wanted to be entertained and they weren't being entertained with Soviet TV. And this was part of the reason why this soft power could be wielded. I love Catherine's idea that we're all diplomats now and there are now so many channels and we get to curate our own experience of being entertained, or at least we think our experience is being curated. I'm interested to hear, Peter, your thoughts, because obviously you thought a lot about some of these ideas, particularly what's going on with, to Catherine's point, internally in Russia and externally using soft power. And it's part of, do you think, kind of this idea of actually you can, if you're curating your own entertainment experience and you can find enough within your frame of reference, then you're not going to hear anything else.
Yes, to a certain extent, we have some evidence about that. But I suppose that what's really changed is the work of whether it's propaganda in its broadest form or public diplomacy or cultural communication, whatever. It is much more segmented nowadays. I mean, you don't have one channel. You know, you're thinking about targeted audiences. How do you get this message to this audience and this to this one? But it's interesting. I've been actually doing a lot of conversations around the former Soviet Union, trying to look at, for example, the Russian messages throughout that space. And they do repeat, despite a certain degree of segmentation. They do kind of repeat. And, you know, they're essentially about Russia being inevitable. You know, it's not even soft power. It's more kind of just like, you ain't running away from us ever power. And then obviously, like, you know, themes like history are used in various very, very manipulative ways. So that, you know, that it remains a huge topic. It remains something that the Russians, partly because they are obsessed with this idea that they lost the Cold War partly because of, that sort of paranoid mentality that we hear Soviet officials using in that clip. A little bit like Hitler in the 30s is obsessed with the idea that Western propaganda destroyed Germany in the First World War. They are obsessed with this idea. They've convinced themselves of it. And in that kind of paranoia, they now spend a lot of effort exporting it. While, until maybe very recently, but even still, there is no concerted plan from the West like there would have been in the Cold War. So at the moment, it's really just Russia and then like bits and bobs of kind of NGOs and stuff trying to help independent media in Kyrgyzstan or something. But it's not, Russia controls the Kyrgyz information space, when you get your TV package in Kyrgyzstan, 3 of the channels are Russian state propaganda channels. And then there's USAID is supporting an anti-corruption NGO of 2 people. So it's, there's only one player in that space at the moment. So it's interesting. There's an afterlife to all this stuff now.
And it's really fascinating. And I'm interested in why. Why do you think? Is it because it's just very hard to, in that way that, since we're all diplomats and there are so many ways, there are so many different channels you can get your information from, in order to have an impact, you have to be so noisy. And to be so noisy, you have to have enough money. And there isn't just the money and the will to do it anymore. Or actually, has everyone given up? Why is it that Russia and China are still pumping money into this and the other countries in the West are less interested?
Well, there's many reasons. The official logic was that after the Cold War, the market would do it and sort it all out. And there was this sort of blind faith that, whatever, that it would just be fine. There'd be free media in these countries and you didn't need this kind of state intervention in these processes anymore. Maybe that's changing. The Russians and Chinese didn't think that. ISIS don't think that. Anyone who's trying to make their way in the world as a rising power, is very much aware of the need, for that sort of investment. Britain never stopped, to be honest. Britain is one of the few that does it, but in a very kind of limited and very selfish and very narrow way, through, the British Council and through the World Service. But it's still one of the things that we're kind of a superpower in.
Sorry, just to interrupt you. When you say selfish, you mean one directional?
No, it's about making Britain look good. It's not about kind of saving the democracy for the world. It's about, Britain, basically. Selfish in a benign way. I don't mean in an evil way. That's what it's about. But I think there might be an awakening. We'll see what comes with the Biden administration and stuff like that. The EU has suddenly started talking about maybe we need a common European, imagined community as well, and not just a trading community. So we have some sort of noises being made which weren't for several decades.
What do you sort of concur with that, Catherine, in your sort of your meanderings across Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see it, you can see it. Whether or not they're succeeding is another matter. But, I think that what we've seen, for example, from the European Commission, since the new commission was set up in 2019, if we see, the way that, it's set up a YouTube channel, you've got, Ursula von der Leyen, doing her briefings, as often as she can. They're putting little clips out on Twitter. All of this, this is neither particularly funky nor particularly innovative nor particularly entertaining, but it's a lot more than they used to manage to do. I think it's much more concerted. I think, there's the realization that, in a world where you might be, constantly asked to choose a camp between, an American camp or buy into a Chinese camp, which would, get you secondary sanctions from the US, basically, that you have to carve out a persona. And I think, and an attractive persona. And I think that from that point of view, we're going to see the EU try and deploy a lot more soft power in possibly a more selfish way, as Peter was using the term, i.e. to make itself look good, not so much into a kind of a dialogue of nations, but, to be an attractive power capable of wielding the kind of soft power that we're talking about. In other words, be attractive enough that people can gather to your interests without you expending too much energy to get them to do that.
But of course, Ursula von der Leyen doing her YouTube videos, or Allegra Stratton's doing that from Downing Street or whatever is not the same as the Scorpions singing Wind of Change, if that really is a story. It's a great podcast anyway, somewhere on Spotify. Or Dallas, pushed through kind of secret CIA funded Finnish TV. Is that stuff still happening, do we think?
I think it's taking place in different ways. So, if you think of a campaign, which I don't think that Eurostar thought of by itself, Eurostar a few years ago started saying, that it was responsible for, X thousands of, Eurostar babies, across Europe and the UK and so on and so forth. This kind of, this strange data that they put out there that basically they had done their bit, to create a kind of, a European population that was, transcultural and so on and so forth. I mean, that kind of thing, I think we're going to see the private sector do more of it. I think that we're going to see, different actors emerge. I think, of course, people like Ursula von der Leyen are not going to invent anything new. But I think we might just see different actors. I mean, are we going to see the equivalent of, Bruce Springsteen, in East Berlin in 1988? Probably not. But something else, I think, something else will emerge. I think the battles are too costly to wage in a different arena. And the cultural arena is probably the obvious one where these battles are going to wage.
There are questions coming in on the Q&A chat, and please do ask them. We've got some time for some questions before we step into our dancing shoes. Carolina has asked whether she thinks that whether you can see the impact. I suppose this is going back to Kiur and Kirsti as well. Do you think you can see the impact and effects of that late 80s, early 90s soft power today? I mean, obviously, in some ways, Kiur, you've alluded to it by talking about, the kind of Ameriphile, whatever the expression is for the lovers of the US still in Finland. Is there evidence that that's had an impact?
Well, as whole this world seen in the Finnish television was really hard not to love. So of course there are impacts. The impacts. We are the impacts here. I mean, Estonia is a free country. We are, I could say, living quite good, living well, happily. I at least hope this is an impact of this this Cold War waged against the Soviet Union with the help of our Finnish sisters and brothers there.
And when the film came out, did you have stories that emerged about, did people kind of the floodgates open and people share their own stories of the impact of the sort of filtering through of information into Estonia?
Yeah, when we were making this film, we actually put the announcement into the newspaper that the people are welcome to share their personal experiences and memories with us about these times and about the experiences with the Finnish television. And there came a lot of mostly funny material.
That's good too. What funny stories?
We actually have used these in the film narrative to kind of mix these into kind of collective memory.
Yes, I just wanted to add that I see two things. First of all, I see that the Finnish language, of course, really, really helped the Estonians to receive the assistance of reform and revival then right after the independence in early 90s. I was living and working in Tallinn from 93 to 98, and the kind of the flood of assistance, because building a state is a lot more complicated than you would think, in particular if you have to build it from scratch. Mm-hmm. And if you want to build it on a completely different building blocks that are there, and this was the Estonian choice. I mean, they chose to build a completely new society, unlike many other ex-Soviet republics. And with the language skills coming from, even from the children's television, they were able to communicate and absorb that assistance in a completely different level than any other. And the other one was then that they were able to absorb the assistance, because as we speak, there are still many, many ex-Soviet states that are struggling with the reforms because they have not been able to absorb the assistance or the democratic value-based new system that has been introduced. And they have the desire to do that. They have the desire to join the European Union and through that path reform their societies. But the ability is not as good as it was in Estonia. And I think this was the thing. They were prepared because they lived in this Estonians, or the large part of Estonians, or let's say that the important part of Estonians, the Tallinn region, they lived in the real world, and that helped them to see that market economy is also, it's not just, manna from heaven, that it requires a lot of work.
That's a very interesting point.
I don't know if Kiur agrees.
Yeah, absolutely. That is most beautifully said.
There's a question, excellent question from Carlos Lozada, who is, I'm going to read out his question because I think it's going to be tricky for us to bring him into the debate. But he says, as a South American and someone who lived under the oppression of Americans, life in the West growing up in a military dictatorship instigated and supported by the Americans, it wasn't great either. I used to look at the Soviet Union as a savior, admire them as the only ones who could stand up to the Americans. Only when I came to the UK and met people from behind the Iron Curtain, I realized all oppressors are the same. Of course, the USA oppressive regime in South America was by proxy, i.e. many Latin American countries under dictatorships had death squads that killed any form of dissent against the USA interests. Have any of the panelists had any experience in comparing and contrasting life under the two different oppressive regimes?
When we made the film, it suddenly started to fly. That was 15 or 12 years ago, something like that. Yeah. And it went to quite many festivals and quite many television channels, like surprisingly for us, being screened in the Korean television wasn't a big surprise because, everyone can imagine that they could kind of relate to the issue of living on the border of two very, or on the border with a very ideological regime and so on. But also in Spain and there were some film festivals and we were having like Q&As and so on and conversations, and a lot of Spaniards of our generation, I mean, born in late 60s, early 70s, they could relate to like our issues through their experience with the Franco regime in their childhood, and that really was eye-opening.
Did they talk, because obviously information was presumably heavily restricted into Spain during that time as well. Were there ways that information was filtered through?
I'm not specialist on the Franco Spain, but as I recall, they were seeing the French TV channels, listening to French, Italian radio, so on, because I don't know how banned the pop music, for instance, was in Franco Spain, but that's definitely it's an interesting point to wage these two oppressed systems.
By kind of wonderful fortuitous situation, Kiur, we just recently made a podcast about Franco Spain and the silences and the oppression of culture that happened during that time. So our listeners can have access to some phenomenal filmmakers and artists who've been documenting kind of the experience of living through Franco's regime and now really trying to relook at how history is told. Now the silences can be broken. I'm wondering if Kirsti or Peter or Catherine have any response to Carlos's point about whether there were other ways, other experiences of sort of cultural diplomacy.
So in my last book, I actually sort of compared my parents' experience in the Soviet Union with the Philippines under the Marcos regime, which was an American supported regime until it wasn't in 1985 and 6 that the Americans abandoned him. But there's a lot of similarities. The Philippines had, dissidents who were quite similar to sort of my parents being dissidents in the Soviet Union, the same little sort of printing presses, and by hand scribbled out sort of like, publications. So there is some similarity, even though the cultural thing less so because, the Philippines were always inundated with American culture. But there were still sort of very strong echoes and the tactics of dissidents, and the tactics of the secret police, how you dodge the secret police. So a lot of similarities there. And I've always wanted that to have a much bigger kind of discussion between the Latin American and Central European experience, and see where, and explore them, explore the similarities and the differences, but also maybe the similarities and differences between different Latin American experiences, which I don't think are all exactly the same.
A quick point on Sputnik and Spanish, because Sputnik's, the Russian propaganda channel's budget in Spanish, I think, is the largest. And the target is not Spain, but South America. So they are really feeding on what was described earlier, feeding on this kind of built-in US, maybe not fear, but disliking. One point. And the other point I wanted to make was that according to my information, in Eastern Germany, the regions which are where the alternative for Deutschland is voted for most are the regions where the Western Germany television wasn't shown or wasn't seen. So this kind of multi-valued, multi-cultural or multi-polar perception that the Western television built in the Eastern Bloc is not only in Estonia, Finland, parallel, but also Germany, Eastern Germany.
That's fascinating to look at the parallels. There's a lovely message from Leila, who is, apologies, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Leila. She says she's from the eastern part of Estonia, and she also danced disco, but her disco moves didn't come in from Finland. They came from Indian movies, from like Bollywood. There was like a whole movement, she said, in her school. And she was commenting that India was a sort of safe zone, a safe place as far as the Soviet Union was concerned. It was sort of parallel decency. And I just love the idea of kind of disco and dance moves coming in from all over and descending on Estonia. Kiur, did you come across any stories about other dance moves that were being danced at the time?
The other dance moves. Well, as a generation, we were not the disco fans either. That was the era of the punk rock and so on, and that was really like rebellious and so on. So disco probably was for the
previous generation.
Yeah, well, whoever, but yes. Yes, and you cannot particularly dance with a punk rock, so the answer is no.
Sort of
sorry,
mosh.
Yeah.
Huge thanks for all of your kind of thoughts and kind of kernels of ideas, and we just began a conversation. Really, it's quite short on Zoom, but I hope I could whet everyone's appetites to watch the rest of the film.
We ended the evening with a disco session, dancing into the night to some great Estonian classics. Many thanks to our amazing guests for the evening, to my brilliant Dash team, Christina Catalina, Sarah Coulson and Bethany Davis, and to our collaborators and supporters, the Estonian Embassy and the Finnish Institute. It was really a pleasure to plot the evening with Kirsti Kaz and Jaak Kilmi&nbsp and colleagues. I hope we've given you a taste of Kiur's fantastic film. We'll post links to the trailer on our show notes. You can catch all our previous podcasts on our website or on your favourite platform. And if you like the Dash Arts podcast, please do share and leave us a review. It helps us stay visible and would mean the world to us. The Dash Arts podcast was produced by Rachel Head. I'm Josephine Burton. We'll be back soon with more conversations. Thank you for listening.
sees, mis leidsid sealt? Kas leidsid vastuse sa klaasi peal? Silmad häbi täis, nõutus pilgust